The hammer rang 3 times before June looked up from the stove. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the door, pulling it open just far enough to see the man standing in her yard, tall, weathered, a canvas bedroll slung across one shoulder, and a battered hat turned in both hands like he was at a funeral and wasn't sure whose. "Mrs. Calloway?" he said. "That's me. Name's Hugh Dalton. I answered the posting at the feed store in town. You said you needed a hand through harvest and into winter, said you'd work out terms." June looked at him a long moment. 40 acres of hard-pan Nebraska soil, a broken fence line running the length of the north pasture, a root cellar with less in it than she'd like, and October already leaning cold against the window panes. She looked at all of that in her mind, and then she looked back at the man. "You got references?" "Foreman at the Hallett spread outside Platte City, and a preacher in Crawford if a preacher counts. Depends on the preacher." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she noted it. "Come in," she said. "I'll pour coffee and we'll talk terms." He wiped his boots at the threshold without being asked. She noted that too. The kitchen was plain and clean, the way June kept everything, by necessity and by habit both. A pot of beans sat low on the stove, 2 cups on the table. She poured and set one in front of the chair across from hers and sat down herself before he did, so he understood whose table it was. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't speak first. She appreciated that. "Room and board," she said. "Meals 3 times a day so long as the work is done. I can't pay wages until the corn brings something, and I won't promise what the market hasn't told me yet. If that's not enough, I won't waste your time." "Room and board is enough for now," Hugh said. "I've wintered in worse situations than a warm house." "It's warm because I cut my own wood," she said, "and you'll cut yours too, if you stay." "That's fair." She studied him over the rim of her cup. Somewhere behind her, down the short hall, a floorboard creaked. She didn't turn around. She said, "That's my son, Eli. He's 8. He stays out of your way unless I tell him otherwise." Hugh nodded once, slow, like a man who understood the weight of what she'd just told him. "Terms agreed," she said. "Terms agreed," he said. She stood and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go first, which told her something about the kind of man he was, or at least the kind he was trying to be. "Barn's out back," she said. "Loft's clean. There's a blanket on the cot." He stood, turned his hat twice more in his hands, and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "June," she said, and surprised herself saying it. "If we're going to work the same land, Mrs. Calloway takes too long." He put the hat on his head. "All right, June." He walked out into the October wind, and she stood in her kitchen listening to the door settle shut behind him, her coffee going cool in her hands, wondering if she'd just made the smartest decision of a hard year, or a decision she'd have to live with through a harder one. Down the hall, Eli's door creaked open. "Mama," he whispered, "is that man staying?" "For a while," she said. "He's big." "Yes." "Does he eat a lot?" She almost smiled. "Go back to bed." The first week, Hugh worked without being told what needed doing. That was the first thing June noticed. He walked the fence line his second morning before she'd even finished breakfast, came back with a list in his head of what posts needed replacing, and asked where she kept the wire. He didn't offer opinions about how she'd been managing. He didn't say a word about the fact that the south gate hung by one hinge, and the vegetable garden had gone a little wild at the edges. He just looked at what was broken and started fixing it. She fed him breakfast, dinner, and supper, same as the agreement said. He ate what she put in front of him without complaint, which she'd learned was rarer in a man than it ought to be. Her late husband, Thomas, rest him, had been particular about onions. Hugh seemed particular about nothing except the work being done right. Eli circled him for the first 3 days like a barn cat circles something unfamiliar, close enough to watch, far enough to run. On the 4th day, June looked out the window while she was rolling biscuit dough and saw Eli standing at the fence where Hugh was stringing wire, not talking, just watching. Hugh didn't shoo him off or make a fuss of him. He just worked, and after a while he said something low that June couldn't hear through the glass, and Eli nodded very seriously and handed him the wire stretcher without being asked again. She kept her face neutral when they came in for dinner. Hugh sat in his usual chair, the one she'd placed at the far end of the table, and Eli sat in his own, and they ate the bean soup in the way that men and boys eat when they've worked together in the cold, with focus and without waste. "The north fence'll be done by Thursday," Hugh said. "Good," she said. "South gate needs a new hinge plate. I can get one in town if you've got a count at the hardware." "I do. I'll write you a note for Mercer's." Eli looked up. "I know where Mercer's is." "Everybody knows where Mercer's is," June said. "Hugh doesn't," Eli said. "He hasn't been to town yet." She looked at her son. "Then I'll draw him a map." "I could show him," Eli said, in the careful way of a boy who has a request he isn't sure will be granted. June looked at Hugh. Hugh looked at his soup and said nothing, which was as diplomatic as she'd seen a grown man be about a child's proposition in some time. "Saturday," she said, "if the fence is done, and you'll walk, not run, and you'll let Mr. Dalton handle the account." "Yes, ma'am." She refilled Hugh's coffee without asking. He said thank you without looking up, and under the table, out of sight, Eli swung his boots very slightly, the way children do when things are going better than they expected. The hinge plate got bought on Saturday. The south gate hung level by the end of the afternoon. June noticed these things the way she noticed everything about her own land, quietly, and with a relief she did not say out loud. By the 3rd week, there was a rhythm to the place that she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not since Thomas died, she supposed, though she didn't spend much time looking at it directly. Hugh rose before light. She knew because she rose before light herself, and she could hear, faintly, the sounds of him moving in the barn below the loft, the creak of wood, the soft shifting of the horses. She would start the stove, and by the time the kitchen was warm enough to see your breath stop fogging, he'd knock twice at the back door and she'd call him in. That knock mattered to her. He knocked every time, never assumed. She began, without quite deciding to, cooking a little more than strictly necessary. An extra biscuit, a deeper pot of stew. She told herself it was because a working man needed feeding, and she wasn't about to shortchange the terms they'd agreed to. She believed this explanation for about a week and a half, before she stopped thinking about it at all, and just added the extra biscuit. Eli had stopped circling. He'd settled, the way children settle when they've decided something is safe. He didn't pepper Hugh with questions the way June half expected. Eli had always been a quiet boy, more watchful than talky, like her in that. But he found reasons to be near. He'd carry water to the barn. He'd appear at Hugh's elbow when Hugh was mending tack, sitting cross-legged on the barn floor with a piece of harness leather in his own lap, practicing knots he wasn't quite sure of. One evening June went to call Eli for supper and found him asleep on the barn floor, his head on a folded horse blanket, a half-knotted piece of leather still in his hand. Hugh was working by lamplight at the other end, quiet and steady, and he'd clearly seen the boy drop off and hadn't waked him. He looked up when June came in. "He went down about an hour ago," Hugh said low. "I didn't think you'd mind." "I don't," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it completely. She gathered Eli up, and the boy stirred just enough to loop an arm around her neck without waking. June carried him to the house. At the door she looked back. The barn light glowed amber across the yard. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Something in her chest she'd held tight for a long time shifted, just slightly, like a fence post settling after new dirt is packed around it. She went inside and didn't look back again. November came in cold and mean. The first real frost hit on a Tuesday, blackening what remained of the kitchen garden and glazing the stock trough solid by morning. Hugh broke the ice with the back of an axe before June had her boots on. She saw him through the window while the coffee was heating, his breath rising in great pale clouds, working with the calm efficiency of a man who has met many winters and does not argue with them. The corn had come in fair, not the yield she'd prayed for, not the disaster she'd feared. Enough to cover the account at Mercer's and put a little against the note at the bank and leave her with a remainder she could work with if she was careful, which she always was. She paid what she owed in town and came home feeling something close to steadiness, not safety. She was too practical to call it that, but steadiness. She told Hugh the account at Mercer's was square. "Good," he said. "I want to talk about the arrangement," she said. He set down the tack he'd been oiling and gave her his attention, the way he always did, fully, without impatience. "I said wages when the corn brought something," she said. "It brought something, not much, but some." She named the figure. It was modest and she knew it. He was quiet a moment. "That's more than fair, June." "It's what I said I'd do," she said. "I do what I say." "I know you do." She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn was very quiet except for the horses and the wind outside finding every gap in the boards. "I'd like you to stay through winter," she said, "if you've no other place to be." "I've no other place to be," he said. That was all that passed between them on that subject, but it felt, to June, like more than it was. She went back to the house and started supper, and didn't think about why her hands were slightly unsteady, measuring the flour. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, June came home from the church ladies' meeting earlier than expected. She heard them before she reached the porch. Not anything alarming, just Eli's voice, chattering the way he so rarely did, and Hugh's lower responses, easy and unhurried. She stopped at the door. Eli was telling Hugh about Thomas, about how his father used to whistle while he worked, the same 3 notes over and over, and how Eli sometimes whistled those notes when he was doing his chores because it made the barn feel less empty. She had not known that about her son. Hugh said, "That's a good way to keep somebody with you." Eli said, "Do you whistle?" Hugh said, "Not well." Eli said, "Papa wasn't good at it either. It was kind of bad, actually, but I still liked it." And Hugh laughed, low, quiet, genuine, a sound June had not heard from him before. She stood on the other side of the door with her hand on the latch and waited until she was sure she had her face arranged correctly before she went in. Nobody said anything about it, but that night at supper, for the first time, the silence at the table was not the silence of strangers keeping a polite distance. It was just quiet, the ordinary quiet of people who have nothing urgent to prove to one another. The trouble came from Renner. Dale Renner owned the feed mill east of town and had been trying to acquire the Callaway acreage since before Thomas was cold. He'd offered twice while Thomas was alive and been refused twice, politely, but without room for negotiation, because Thomas had built that land himself and was not a man who sold what he'd built. June had refused him once more after the funeral, and he had smiled in the patient way of men who believe a woman's decisions have a shelf life. He came in the first week of December in a wool coat that cost more than June's monthly account at the mercantile, and he brought with him a man named Holt from the bank in Hastings, and they sat at June's kitchen table while she stood. She did not offer them coffee. "The note," Renner said, "is due 1st of January. I've spoken to the bank about acquiring it. If you can't make the payment in full, the land goes to auction." "I'm aware of the terms of my own note," June said. "The full balance," Holt said. not unkindly, in the voice of a man delivering a verdict he considers inevitable, is $340. The room was very still. June had the corn money, what remained of it. She had the wages she hadn't yet drawn from her own account because there hadn't been cause to touch them. She had, in the careful arithmetic of a careful woman, perhaps $200 she could put her hands on without selling anything she needed for spring. $140 short. "I see," she said, in the tone she used when she was thinking, and didn't want anyone to know she was thinking. Renner leaned forward slightly, the way he always did when he sensed an opening. "June, I want to make this easy for you. I'll take the land at fair market and you'd walk away with enough to—" "I'll have the payment by January 1st, June said. "Now, June, thank you for coming," she said. "I'll see you out." They went. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, breathing through her nose, looking at nothing in particular, and seeing numbers. When she lifted her eyes, Hugh was standing in the doorway to the back porch, his hat off, his coat still on. She hadn't heard him come in. "How much?" he said. She told him. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper and set it on the table. She looked at it without touching it. "I've been holding wages from the Hallett spread," he said. "Didn't have cause to spend them. It's not all of it, but it's enough with what you have." She looked up at him. "Hugh," she said, carefully, "I won't take charity." "It's not charity," he said, equally carefully. "It's a loan, if you want it to be, with whatever terms you want to put to it, or consider it wages against next year's work, if that sits easier with you. The terms are yours to set." He paused. "The land's not." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind pressed against the house the way it did all through December, testing the walls, finding them holding. "I'll set terms," she said. "I expect nothing less," he said. She picked up the paper and didn't count it in front of him, which was its own kind of trust. The note was paid on the 28th of December. June brought the receipt home from Hastings and put it in the tin box where she kept the deed and the few important papers of her life. And she stood looking into the tin box for a while before she closed it. Renner said nothing when he heard. She had expected him to. Men like Renner always had something to say when things didn't go their way. But the word that came back to her through the church ladies was only that he'd gone to look at a parcel south of the river instead, and she supposed that was the end of it, or near enough. Christmas was quiet. She made a roast. There was a dried apple pie that Eli had helped with more than was strictly useful, but she'd let him help anyway. The table had 3 places set, and it had been 3 places since sometime in November, though she couldn't name the exact day that had changed. She could name the day she'd noticed it. She'd come down one morning and found Eli already at the table, and he'd set 3 cups out without thinking about it, without it being a decision, the way children do things that have become ordinary to them. He'd set Hugh's cup at the end of the table, where Hugh always sat, and he'd put a spoon beside it the same as the others. June had stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking at those 3 cups and that extra spoon. She had not moved them. That was the day she knew what the arithmetic of her heart had been working toward while she'd been paying attention to other sums. It hadn't felt like a thunderclap or a revelation. It had felt like a fence post settling, like something that had been leaning a long time finally finding its proper ground. She didn't do anything about it immediately. She was not a woman who moved on feeling alone. But she started paying attention to things she'd been careful not to pay attention to before. The way Hugh held a door, the way he listened when she talked, not with half his mind elsewhere, but with all of it, his eyes on hers, his hands still. The way he'd started somewhere in November, leaving his hat on the peg inside the door instead of taking it back to the barn, and neither of them had remarked on it, and there it had stayed. January thawed early, which was a mercy. February came in with one hard week of cold that kept them all inside, and on the second day of that week Hugh brought in extra firewood without being asked, and stacked it inside the back door where it would stay dry, and Eli sat at the table doing his reading lessons, and Hugh sat across from him with a piece of harness work, and June made bread, and the kitchen was close and warm and smelled like wood smoke and yeast, and outside the Nebraska wind did its worst against walls that held. On the third evening of that hard week, June set the bread on the table and sat down and looked at Hugh across the lamp, and she said, "I've been thinking about the arrangement." He looked up, patient, waiting. "We had a practical agreement," she said. "Room, board, wages, work for shelter." "We did," he said. "I want to renegotiate," she said. Something crossed his face. Not alarm. Something quieter and more careful than alarm. "I'm listening," he said. She folded her hands on the table the way she did when she was going to say something plainly, without ornament, because she was a plain-spoken woman, and this was not the moment to be anything else. "I think you ought to stay," she said, "not as a hand, as something with more permanence to it, if that's agreeable to you." Eli had gone very still over his reader. Hugh said, "Are you saying what I think you're saying, June?" "I expect I am," she said. "I'm not good at circles. I usually go straight at a thing." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man who is uncertain, the silence of a man who is being careful with something he doesn't want to drop. "I've been hoping," he said, "for most of October." She felt warmth move up from her chest to her face, which was uncommon enough for her that she noticed it. "You were not obvious about it," she said. "I didn't think it was my place to be." "It's your place now," she said, "if you want it." He looked at her the way he'd looked at that note on the table in December, like something being offered that he'd given up expecting. "Yes," he said, "I want it." Eli made a sound that was not quite a word and entirely an opinion, and both of them looked at him, and his face was doing something complicated that resolved into a grin he couldn't hold back any longer. "I already set his place," Eli said, as if this settled everything, and perhaps it did. The circuit preacher came through on the 14th of March, which was a Saturday, and there was a small gathering at the church that would have been called a wedding if you wanted to be formal about it, and a settling if you wanted to be plain. June wore the blue dress she'd been saving for occasions, and she braided her hair herself, and Hugh wore the jacket she'd let out a half-inch at the shoulders the week before, without explaining why she was doing it, and he'd let her do it without asking. She supposed that was the whole of their courtship, if you wanted to catalog it. Two people who'd paid attention to each other's needs before they'd named what they felt, until the naming was almost a formality behind the fact. The preacher, a gentleman named Whitmore who'd known Thomas and did not make mention of it at a moment when mention would have been complicated, kept the words simple and clear. June repeated them in her steady voice, and Hugh repeated them in his low one, and when it was done, Eli stood between them, and Hugh put his hand on the boy's shoulder the way he'd done 100 times in the barn, without ceremony and without weight, and the boy leaned into it a little, the way children lean into things that are solid. They walked home in the March light, the three of them, and the land lay around them quiet and still, waiting to be worked, the way land always is, the way good things always are. That evening she made a roast again, because it was that kind of day, and afterward Hugh built a shelf on the kitchen wall that she'd mentioned needing in November, and there was no ceremony about that either, just the sound of the work being done in the lamplight, and Eli asleep already, and the wind outside doing what the Nebraska wind does, but doing it to a house that had found its shape. June sat in her chair and watched Hugh work and thought about how a practical woman had sat down at this table in October to negotiate fair terms, and had ended up with something that had no good practical name, which was perhaps the best argument she'd ever seen against pure practicality as a way of life. She thought Thomas would have appreciated the man. She was fairly sure he would have. That thought had the gentle, settled weight of something she'd been carrying carefully for a while now, and had finally found a place to put down. Hugh finished the shelf. He looked at it, ran his thumb along the edge to check the level, seemed satisfied. He turned and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "It's a good shelf." "Told you it would be. You never said a word about it until November, and then I had to mention it twice." "I heard you the first time," he said. She almost laughed. She did not, quite, but it was close. He came and sat in the chair across the table, the chair that was his chair now in all the ways that mattered, and he reached across and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat that way in the lamplight while the fire burned and the Nebraska night pressed cold and indifferent against the walls of the house that held. There is a kind of love that announces itself in grand gestures and sweeping words, and then there is the kind that shows up in a yard with a bedroll and a battered hat and starts fixing what is broken. One kind makes for good stories told quickly. The other kind makes for good lives. What June and Hugh built that year on 40 acres of Nebraska hardpan was not perfect. The land was difficult. The winters were long. The bank had opinions about everything. But every meal she put on the table was answered by work done without complaint. Every act of care she offered was repaid in wood cut and fences mended and a boy taught to tie a proper knot. And somewhere in between October and March, a practical agreement became something that had no clause for ending. If you've ever negotiated your way into something better than you bargained for, you know what I mean. If you haven't, I hope this story gives you reason to believe it's possible. Sometimes the hand you shake at the beginning is the hand you hold at the end, and the only difference is everything that happened between. I'd love to know, have you ever made a practical decision that turned into something you hadn't expected? Leave a comment and tell me about it. And if this story found its way to you today and stayed with you a while, we'd be glad to have you subscribe and join us for more journeys through the Old West, where hard land sometimes makes the softest hearts. Good night. God bless you and the people around your table.